For decades, the United States has alternated between confrontation and collaboration, frequently applying unfounded, countervailing, and anti-dumping duties against Canadian softwood. Let's be clear, Canada does not dump lumber into the United States. When President Trump decided to raise tariffs on softwood lumber from Canada to nearly 35%, this past August he argued that Canada was unfairly selling lumber to the United States at low prices. However, the situation is not as simple as it seems. Canada currently provides nearly 70% of the softwood lumber that the U.S. imports, a trade relationship that has been established and developed over many decades, supporting various sectors, from housing construction to disaster recovery in states like California. What the Trump administration fails to mention is that the U.S. timber and lumber industry is currently unable to replace the supply of lumber imported from Canada. Although the U.S. has vast forests, it lacks the processing mills and skilled labor required. In discussions on Fox Business, many industry experts stated that it would take between 5 to 10 years for the U.S. to expand its domestic production capacity. This also does not take into account the federal regulations regarding access to forest resources, which remain a politically and legally contentious issue. The countervailing duties that are set to go up very soon, this ludicrous Section 232 investigation. And so, we could be dealing with duties and tariffs combined, well over 35%. I think Americans are going to be finding out very shortly the impact that these duties are going to be having on them. The impact of the tariff increase is not just on paper or in the statistics. Many people have already started to feel the effects in real life, according to predictions from economists, including sources from Investopedia. Rising lumber prices could cause construction costs to increase by 10 to 15% in areas that frequently face wildfires, such as California, where there is an urgent need for rebuilding homes. This means families will bear additional cost, face longer waiting times, and have fewer options when rebuilding their homes. And it's not just disaster-stricken areas that are affected, from suburban residential areas in Texas to multifamily housing projects in Illinois. Many developers are reconsidering the timelines and budgets for their projects. Previously, Trump had committed to promoting more housing construction to address the housing crisis. But now the tariff policy he is pursuing could be one of the reasons for the escalating costs of building new homes. The forest industry is a pillar of the Canadian economy. Today, I'm announcing a series of new measures to help the softwood lumber industry pivot to a growing Canadian market and to the markets of reliable trading partners around the world. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney chose not to engage in a confrontational approach. Instead, he opted for a different path. His government announced a support package worth over $1 billion Canadian dollars for the softwood lumber industry, including loan guarantees, funding to develop new products, and direct support for workers in the sector. The largest portion, about $700 million, will be allocated to small and medium-sized businesses, those facing cash flow difficulties after nearly a decade of volatile trade conditions. However, Carney's move this time is not just financial support. It is a long-term strategic step. He has directly linked this investment to the newly launched $25 billion National Housing Program, which the government kicked off in the fall. Canadian lumber will not remain idle in storage. It will be used to build affordable housing within the country. Carney's message is clear. If the U.S. is not willing to buy lumber from Canada, Fairly Canada will create its own market. The U.S. could increase the amount that it imports from countries like Germany or Sweden in terms of just softwood, but they do not have enough to completely replace how much we get from Canada. The U.S. may impose tariffs, but halting reliance on softwood lumber from Canada is not straightforward. Countries considered as alternative sources, such as Sweden or Germany, simply do not have the production capacity to make up for the supply shortage. Meanwhile, U.S. sawmills have been operating at full capacity for some time, and there are no signs of any significant increase in production. For this reason, Canada's calm approach has proven to be highly reasonable, and persuasive Prime Minister Carney and his ministers are shifting towards a diversification strategy with trade promotion, trips to markets like Vietnam and Japan, while also expanding the customer base. For Canada's lumber industry, as British Columbia's Minister of Forestry, Ravi Parmar, stated, Americans will soon feel the impact, not just through trade statistics, but also in lumber prices, housing prices, and the materials they rely on daily. What Trump calls an aggressive trade strategy could, in fact, become a self-inflicted blow to the U.S. economy. Meanwhile, Canadian softwood lumber producers have enough financial resources to endure, enough time to adapt, and political support to adjust. The Carney government has even started preparing skills transition programs for around 6,000 workers in the sector. It's not because the lumber industry is declining, it's because it is growing. And while Canada is accelerating its future, pressure is beginning to mount on the Trump administration. Rising material costs, struggling investors, and U.S. consumers paying higher prices all point to one clear thing: Canada is unwavering while the U.S. imposes more tariffs. Canada is strengthening its internal capacity, and in this confrontation, it's not the louder voice that will win, but the side that knows how to build for the long term that will hold the advantage. Canada is not open to us, they need to open their market. Unless they're willing to open their market, they're going to pay a tariff. The trade negotiations between Canada and the U.S. are now entering the most sensitive and decisive phase ever as the deadline set by President Trump approaches. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick has made it clear that if Canada does not open its market, tariff measures will be implemented. However, in Ottawa, the government has no intention of backing down. Prime Minister Mark Carney is actively working with U.S. senators and provincial premiers to find a common approach. The dream of completely removing tariffs is no longer a realistic goal. Instead, Canada is shifting towards negotiating a selective, sector-specific agreement. The aim is to avoid widespread economic losses while restoring stability and predictability for businesses, even if that means some tariffs will still remain in place. They want to ensure that they're able to provide high-quality, low-cost building materials for Americans at the end of the day. But also, it's a recognition that in this reality that we're in with this president, we got to put some things on the table to have conversations. Amid the escalating tensions, an issue that seemed old is now becoming more prominent than ever. Softwood lumber, the province of British Columbia, has been subjected to U.S. tariffs on this product for many years, but for the first time, Canadian officials, including Premier David Eby, have publicly expressed a willingness to consider the option of implementing export quotas as part of the trade agreement. This marks a significant shift from previous stances, where the idea of quotas was completely rejected. With over $7 billion in tax revenues held in escrow accounts, and with trade negotiations under intense pressure, softwood lumber is no longer just a victim. It is becoming a strategic bargaining chip that Canada can use in negotiations. Why now? Because this industry could deliver a quick and symbolic deal. Softwood lumber is a major sector with strong ties between the two countries, and it carries enough political weight to apply pressure without touching on more sensitive areas, such as dairy or automobiles. Look, we gotta be honest with ourselves as Canadians, and I think the Carney government has done a good job at this in its sort of early days. This is Trump's strategy, right? Exactly what you just described. That's what his sort of MO has been. However, the strategy that Canada is pursuing this time is far from easy. Trump's trade strategy is built on unpredictability, constantly changing deadlines, making unclear demands, and threatening to overturn the entire USMCA agreement. In 2026, this intentionally disruptive approach forces other countries to react passively rather than proactively planning. Former New Brunswick Premier Brian Gallen, who participated in high-level meetings, referred to it as deliberate chaos. But this time, Canada is not falling into that trap. Prime Minister Carney's government has chosen to stay calm. They are not reacting emotionally, but are focused on maintaining discipline, listening to the provinces, adjusting federal priorities, and expanding their strategy beyond North America. Canada's response has been somewhat quiet, but it is clearly coordinated. Ontario focuses on protecting the automotive industry. British Columbia has proactively brought softwood lumber to the negotiating table. Quebec calls for transparency on timelines and roadmaps. Despite differences, the provinces are showing rare unity. Nationally, Canada is strengthening its position. Bill C-5 has been introduced to remove domestic trade barriers, an important step toward enhancing self-reliance. At the same time, investments in infrastructure, energy, and mining are being prioritized, particularly when there is cooperation between provinces. On the foreign front, Canada is expanding its influence, from strengthening ties with Mexico and the European Union to restarting dialogue with the G7 nations. The message is clear. Canada no longer wants to rely solely on Washington. Trump may continue to use the tariff card, but the cost of doing so is becoming increasingly evident, not just for Canada, but also for the U.S. Softwood lumber. Tariffs have caused construction costs to rise in many parts of the U.S., especially in markets that have traditionally relied heavily on lumber imports from Canada. U.S. lawmakers are feeling the pressure. A bipartisan delegation of senators is currently in Ottawa not to impose conditions, but to find ways to maintain economic stability. The longer the standoff continues, the more Canadian industries are accelerating their efforts to reduce reliance on the U.S. And that's the paradox. The more Trump tightens the screws, the more Canada stands firm and proactive. This is not just a trade dispute. It is a true test of policy planning, foreign affairs, and internal unity. Softwood may not be a glamorous issue, but right now it symbolizes something greater. A country's ability to stand its ground, know when to compromise wisely, and defend its sovereignty without fanfare. Trump may continue to impose tariffs, but if that happens, the response won't just echo back to Ottawa. It will reverberate across construction sites in the U.S., resonate in congressional meetings, and become evident in investors' financial reports. And very likely it will be Canada's quiet, steadfast resolve, rather than the noise from Washington, that will shape the final outcome. Deadline is just hours away. Canada still has not secured a deal. That means Canada could face a 35% blanket tariff from the U.S. starting tomorrow on products not covered by our free trade deal. On August 1st, President Trump followed through on his previous warning. Canada now faces a 35% tariff on items deemed non-compliant with CUSMA. This is seen as a move to exert pressure and punish Canada for delaying the signing of the new trade agreement. However, as the tariffs began to take effect, many realized that something didn't quite add up. The oil sector, Canada's most strategic export industry, was not affected at all, while steel, aluminium, auto parts, and even copper pipe were included in the new regulations. Crude oil exports from Canada, which account for 50 to 70% of U.S. oil imports, remain exempt. This is not a minor detail. Canada exports over 4 million barrels of oil per day to the U.S., mostly heavy crude, that is refined in plants across the U.S. Midwest. If Trump truly wanted to target a vulnerability in the U.S., clearly this was not the moment he chose to do so. And this is not simply due to luck. Canada's export activities have long been carefully shaped. According to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, over 80% of Canada's exports to the U.S. remain within the protective scope of CUSMA. This category includes not only oil, but also natural gas, essential food products, and many auto parts produced within the shared supply chains of both countries, even with copper, one of the targets Trump set his sights on. The actual impact is quite limited. The 50% tariff only applies to semi-finished copper products such as pipes and wires, while Canada primarily exports cathodes, anodes, and concentrate, forms that are completely exempt from the tariff. In reality, Trump's move on copper sounds much more serious than the actual impact it has. By reorganizing trade flows around items that comply with CUSMA, Canada not only stands firm against Washington's new tariffs, but also calculates a way to navigate and move beyond them. Does Canada have any leverage in these trade negotiations? Not much, and you've seen that even though we have probably the most ideal prime minister to be negotiating, the problem is that Canada doesn't have a lot of leverage here, in part because you're dealing with a crazy person, and it's really hard to negotiate crazy. But then a new factor emerged, this time leaning more towards politics than economics. Just hours before the deadline, President Trump posted on Truth Social, unexpectedly linking the trade negotiations to Canada's recognition of the state of Palestine. Suddenly, the entire story shifted from a matter of tariffs to one of geopolitics. Trump used Canada's foreign policy stance